This is a recording of a presentation by consumer advocate Ralph Nader at the County College of Morris on February 26, 1974.
Tonight we have invited back to County College of Morris a man who is dedicated with his crusade, of which is, of course, to make this world a cleaner, healthier, and safer place in which to live. With our oil shortages and long gas lines, he could not have been here at a more opportune time. I can almost be certain that most of you have had siphoned gas out of your neighbor's tank to get here tonight. Well, that's how it goes, I guess. Well, I'd like to let him on now, the man who is going to speak on the energy crisis, Ralph Nader.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Any commentary on the energy crisis can't avoid commenting on the latest events. And if some of you heard Mr. Nixon yesterday prescribe the programs that he felt would help alleviate the energy crisis, they are consistent with Mr. Simon's past statements, which in effect exclude sacrifice on the part of the big oil companies and put the brunt on the public, both in terms of the economic brunt and in terms of the health and safety aspects of the so-called energy crunch. You may recall he said that he hoped that there would be some amendments of the environmental standards, so dirtier coal could be burned. That means higher morbidity, respiratory ailments. He also said that there should be deregulation of natural gas, which he didn't translate out in terms of the billions of dollars every year that would cost consumers for no reason whatsoever other than to raise the price of natural gas, most of which is owned by the big oil companies, to meet the higher price of the oil, most of which is owned by the big oil companies. It was really sort of like a lesson in reverse economics, where you have the President of the United States recommending that the government permit the price of one form of energy, gas, to be raised in order to meet the higher price competition, oil. The way I learned economics, the one reason for dealing with prices is to reduce them to meet the competition. You never raise them to meet the competition. Well, this is the brand of leadership that the country has at the present time. It's a leadership so cowardly, so indentured to the big oil companies, that even when people are pleading for the facts, when there is massive discomfort, massive inflation, when the poor are being hit worse than anyone, when there is all kinds of evidence that storages and supplies of petroleum products are at record levels, still the policies that come out of Washington are designed to maximize the burden on the consumer from an economic and health point of view. The burden is going to total $24 billion this year. That's what the energy bill is going to increase by in 1 year, and another $30 billion easily in terms of indirect costs, such as higher price for steel, higher prices for automobiles, and other products whose production involves the consumption of significant amounts of energy. Now, it is really anomalous that a handful of big oil companies can push around the U.S. government and a couple 100 million Americans. This is more a testament to the abdication and weakness of the people than it is to the strength of the oil majors. They have power. They buy and sell governments. They buy and sell elections. They are the biggest recipients of corporate welfare by a government in the history of our land through tax privileges and other loopholes, but they are not omnipotent. They basically are well organized and they know what they want and they go after it. Whereas people are not well organized, although they may know what they want, they don't go after it. The average waiting time for gasoline in New Jersey, I'm told now, is anywhere from an hour to 2.5 hours. And if you consider the millions of hours that are being spent waiting at a gas station, tempers flaring, or worse, it is perhaps permissible to ask how much time these same citizens are devoting to shaking their members in Congress to do something, and do it specifically without rhetoric or other deviation. I would suggest that if people would spend 10 minutes for every 100 minutes that they wait in line pushing their members of Congress to support some explicit proposals, which I will describe tonight and which are already introduced in the Senate with 21 senators in support of, that there would be both a short-term and long-term solution to this energy fabrication, and that the burden would shift on the big oil companies and off the backs of consumers, workers, and a number of small businesses in the oil industry who have been giving the oil majors their principal price competition. But before I go into that subject, which is the Consumer Energy Act of 1974, sponsored by 21 senators, led by Senator Warren Magnuson, a real power in the Senate from the state of Washington, and such senators as Senator Hart, Senator Kennedy, Senator Mondale, Senator Nelson. I want to emphasize how important it is to have a sense of history in order to understand how this came about. If we look at our educational process from our own experience as we went through elementary, secondary, and college, as well as from the experience of students today, it is noteworthy that there is very little time devoted to the study of American industry and commerce. American history, if we remember, is largely a recounting of political and military phenomena. Gettysburg, Valley Forge, Teddy Roosevelt, populist progressive movement, Reconstruction, and so forth. There is almost no attention paid to those forces whose successors now say built America, namely industry. How much, for example, do college seniors know about the oil industry? In fact, one way to discover the deficiency of that educational process is simply to sit down and see if you can write 300 words, free flow, on any of the following industries: the oil industry, the auto industry, the steel industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry, and for New Jersey, the pharmaceutical industry. I've tried that with students, and it's pretty much a flunk out. The essays are riddled with brand names, which they have learned by watching television. But largely, anything about the evolution and structure of these industries, who controls what, and what their record has been over the years, escapes the students. That's why I think so much of this energy crunch has come upon us without a framework of understanding as to how it was calculated, why it was calculated, and for what purposes. If we go back to the beginning of the oil industry, the modern oil industry got underway over 100 years ago when the first strike was made in Pennsylvania, old Colonel Drake, in 1859. But the modern oil industry got underway in this century. And starting in the 1920s, in particular, the oil companies And there were big ones then too. Remember the Standard Oil Trust around the turn of the century? Around the turn of the century, there was a monopolistic aspect to the oil industry. But in the 20s, the big question was, how do we control supply of oil? If there is too much supply by too many producers, all of whom are competing with one another, then it's going to be difficult to keep the price up. Because you get a flood of supply, it drives the price down. That's supposedly called competition, except the oil companies call it ruinous competition. Because that means competition that works, you see, is ruinous competition. The struggle to control supply became the all-consuming passion of the big oil majors. And when I say that, I'm referring to now the companies that are called Exxon, Texaco, Mobil, Gulf, Shell, BP, or British Petroleum, and Standard Oil of California. These are the so-called Seven Sisters, the international oil companies that make up the world oil cartel. Their main goal was somehow, together with lesser-sized companies, their main goal was to develop a framework of private and public government to limit supply. This is why anytime there is any slight evidence that there's going to be oil found in any underdeveloped country in the world, single, the oil companies would be there. Not because they needed the oil, because they had to take control of every potentially new supply. The Middle East, of course, was the most massive and easily accessible source of oil discovered. Indeed, it's been described as a sea of oil, some of these fields. The oil is so accessible that even as of January 1974, the amortized cost to produce a barrel of Iranian oil and put it on a tanker in an Iranian port is 10.5 cents. A barrel of oil, 42 gallons. That isn't, of course, what it sells for. That's what it takes in terms of the cost of production, amortizing exploration and production costs at the present time. It used to be even cheaper. It used to be 6 cents. And when you've got a situation like that, you have a basis for a collusive opportunity. Because if Iranian oil years ago ever hit the market at 40 cents a barrel or 50 cents a barrel into this country, it would wreak price havoc with domestic oil, which of course is more expensive. And when the American oil companies in particular set up shop in the Middle East, they set up shop by virtue of what the economists call joint ventures. A joint venture is a group of two or more oil companies operating one business. And so when people say, is there really a conspiracy among the oil companies? My answer is that it doesn't have to be in any backroom sense, that they are one to begin with as part of these joint ventures. The importance here can be grasped by the following recounting. We've all heard of Aramco, which is probably is going to be disclosed as the most profitable company in the world. Its books have always been very secret because it is a totally owned subsidiary of the following four companies which you might have heard of. Texaco, 30%, Exxon, 30%, Chevron, 30%, Mobil, 10%. Now, why do they have to conspire with one another? They're in the same business together, called Aramco. Iranian oil participants, that's the giant that explores and produces oil in Iran. Mobil owns 7%, Exxon 7%, Chevron 7%, Texaco 7%, Gulf 7%, British Petroleum 40%, Shell 14%, Atlantic 1.67%, Signal 0.83%, and Getty 0.83%. Another joint venture. Iraq Petroleum Company, composed of BP, Shell, Exxon, Mobil. In this country, when they drill offshore, they bid offshore for leases. they bid as joint ventures. There are other places where they can, come to common agreements through their trade associations, the American Petroleum Institute, the American Gas Association, and other trade associations. Also, they form powerful advisory committees to the federal government. The National Petroleum Council advises the Department of Interior, which is better called the accounts receivable for the oil industry. There are other oil and gas advisory committees where they really shape policy, because the government isn't really the government in the common sense of the term. The government's oil policy makers are men who come from, guess what industry? The oil industry. They come for a couple years of on-the-job training before they go back to their companies at higher executive levels. Even today, Mr. Simon comes from an investment banking firm in New York, which has extensive businesses with the oil industry. The people who wrote the allocation regulations that you have to suffer by. The people who wrote the allocation regulations that you have to suffer by were oil men, formerly oil men, now for a part-time tour of duty in the federal government. The number 3 man in Interior, Mr. Wakefield, comes from a Texas oil and gas law firm, to which he will undoubtedly return. The number 2 man in the Department of Defense, responsible for the Defense Department's relations with the oil industry, Mr. Clements, formerly the owner of a giant oil drilling firm in Texas. And, the list just goes on and on. The head of the Oil Policy Committee comes from guess where, and so forth. So when somebody says, is there a federal energy policy? No, not in the common sense of the term. It's the oil industry energy policy. For many years, the process of controlling supply went on with very little public disclosure. A professor nearby here wrote a book, Robert Engler, called The Politics of Oil. It came out in 1961. It's been reissued in paperback. And it was a marvelous study, great detail, and it hardly got any attention. The world government of oil was sub rosa. It was often considered too complex for newsmen to understand. They would have to take out several weeks, and here they are pushing deadlines every day and having no time for this. The important thing about this control of supply is that the documents are now coming out in Senator Church's inquiry on multinational oil companies in the Senate. For instance, he now has documents showing the following, and sworn testimony by the participants, that the U.S. government dropped a criminal prosecution for violation of the antitrust laws against the big oil companies in the early 1950s on the grounds of national security. That, of course, is the defense system of the oil industry. Everything it does overseas is national security, so of course it doesn't have to succumb to the normal rule of law. Also documented is that the oil companies overseas, the consortium of oil companies, had aggregate production quotas. One of the reasons why the Shah of Iran, in effect, moved to nationalize his oil industry a little over a year and a half ago was because he didn't think the oil companies were exporting enough oil. And true enough, now revealed is a document called the APQ document, the aggregate production quota document, where they limited exports so as not to drive the price down from an abundance of supply. In the 1950s also, the beginnings of the safety net were established. The safety net flowered in the 1960s, which permitted, in effect, the waiver in secret based on a representation by a New York corporate lawyer of great eminence, notoriety perhaps is a better word, John McCloy, who represents 31 oil companies. It's a real competitive industry. They all have the same lawyer. to, in effect, permit them to waive the antitrust laws abroad. Well, that permitted even more behind-the-scenes shenanigans, all of which ended up either on the back of the American consumer or the American taxpayer. For instance, in the early 50s, the oil-producing companies, having been shafted long enough by the oil companies, there were times when they paid incredibly for not getting smart and bargaining tougher. They were mercilessly exploited in the price of oil given them per barrel. But when they started demanding more, the U.S. oil companies went to Washington and they said, look, Washington, these countries in the Middle East want more money. And Washington said, my. And the oil companies said, well, you know, if they don't get more money, they might go communist. National security. And Washington said, oh. And it was then suggested that maybe the oil companies could pay that more money. And the oil companies said, oh no, we can't pay that money, but we have a suggestion. The money that we pay extra can be called taxes to these countries. And if you will simply issue a regulation by the Treasury Department, mind you, no Congress, no public hearings, and allow us to set off these taxes, otherwise known as royalties, that we pay to these foreign countries against our federal taxes, then we'll go ahead and pay them higher prices. And so the Treasury Department said, fine, give us a draft, and they typed out the regulation. What this meant was the following. If Exxon paid, let's say, Iran, $2 more a barrel royalties, which were called foreign taxes, they would take that $2 and reduce their federal income tax in this country by $2, which means billions of dollars overall, which means that the small taxpayer takes the burden, either in form of higher taxes to pay the difference, fewer government services, or paying the interest on growing government debt. And, of course, the result is simply to make the oil companies richer. Now, you know, when you see something like that happen, power play, secrecy, not even bringing Congress into it, when in effect the oil companies are saying, sure, we'll pay higher prices, but the taxpayer will really pay it, not us, through this gimmick, that has to be considered institutionalized crime and nothing less. There's a great deal of emphasis in recent years on crime in the streets. Well, the biggest crime of all can be called crime in the suites, the corporate suites. The massive multi-billion-dollar rip-offs that don't even cause a ripple for years because nobody knows about it. Or they're wrapped in complex cocoons called national security. Last year, according to the FBI, bank robbers had one of their best years. They took about $10 to $11 million from the nation's banks. The oil companies' tax shenanigans end up several billion a year in 1 year. And yet I don't see any oil company on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. I don't see any FBI agents or even IRS agents spending much time there. They're too busy catching the local bank robber. The importance of understanding industry structure extends to this country as well. In the 30s, they decided that those Texas oil fields are too productive. They can really drive the price down. So they got what was called an interstate oil compact passed through Congress and through the states. This permitted Texas and Louisiana and other oil-producing states, permitted them to put production controls on the wells. Now, the theory was that this was for conservation purposes. And there was something to that. That is, if you take too much out of a well too fast, you'll ruin its capacity to produce later. But there was also another factor in whether they said, well, this well can only produce 80% this month, or 65%. And that was a factor called economic demand, which of course led the state government authorities under the heavy tutelage of the oil companies to pretty much put the pro-rationing formula on these wells at the stage where the price could be supported in the marketplace. But that wasn't enough. In the late 50s, the oil companies here and abroad wondered what was going to happen when that Iranian oil gush and that other oil gush in the Middle East was going to hit the country here. They were particularly worried about Iran, which had a fast developing production level. And so they got an oil import quota, a wall around the U.S. limiting the amount of oil that could be imported. This, of course, protected a high price of gasoline and home fuel oil. And as a result, consumers were paying $5 to $7 billion a year. By 1970, who says so? President Nixon's own task force report on the oil import quota. It's one of the reasons why they recommended its abolition. Instead, Mr. Nixon abolished the task force. The oil import quota wasn't abolished until April of 1973. Well now, if you add that with all the tax privileges, oil depletion allowance, investment tax credits, invisible drilling expenses, it is no wonder that the oil companies would register the following. Gulf Oil, a couple years ago, paid 1.5% federal income tax. Atlantic Richfield, several years ago, made millions and millions of dollars, paid 0 federal income tax. The average federal income tax payment a couple years ago for the big oil companies was about 9.5%. A mechanic pays a higher percent. I was almost going to say the president pays higher percent than that. What is important to recognize here is that a tax loophole is just the same as a federal subsidy. If the federal government was supposed to get, say, $100 million in taxes from a company in the normal rate, 48%, if instead they only got $50 million because of a tax loophole, that's exactly equivalent to the government getting the $100 million and giving him back 50. That's corporate welfare. Companies don't go bankrupt anymore. They just go to Washington. The big companies, that is. The small business, they go out by tens of thousands. They don't weep in Washington over small business. But try a Penn Central or a Lockheed, and you'll see Washington run to the assistance. This type of private government of oil has finally had its consequences in an eruptive manner starting last year. If you think the big oil companies were sorrowful over the Arab embargo, think again. It was like manna from heaven for them, because it gave them the protective excuse to put into lockstep, rapid action their strategy for this country, which is the following. One, to drive out the independents, or buy them out, or make them put the brand of Exxon on their small business forehead. That was necessary in order to move their profits downstream, as the big majors have in effect conceded. Number two, they had to double the price of energy. Now, how do you do that? That takes really some doing. But with this Arab embargo announcement, and there has really hardly been an Arab embargo, which I'll describe in a moment, but it was psychologically a beautiful tool for the major oil companies in this country. Panic, stampede, economic cataclysm, all the imagery of late 73. And up started the price. And it'll double. The question is, will it go over 75 cents this year? That's the question. It'll double. And by doubling, of course, the profits reflect themselves, skyrocketing. Exxon, Texaco, one after another announcing these profit increases. Next, they want to drive back the environmental movement. Somehow they don't like clean air at their expense. In effect, they want to loosen not only pollution controls, burning high sulfur fuel and so forth, which are perfect coordinates with higher respiratory diseases, pollution, higher respiratory diseases. People are going to die, get sick. Property is going to be further damaged. But they're also moving offshore around the Atlantic and Florida littorals to get the leases, to get them cheap, and to get them without any hassle. Property is going to be further damaged. But they're also moving offshore around the Atlantic and Florida littorals to get the leases, to get them cheap, and to get them without any hassle from the environmentalists. And they're also moving to take over greater control of other forms of energy so these forms of energy don't threaten their hegemony. So they're moving, they already control oil and gas. They're moving to control coal. The oil companies now control 30% of the coal reserves, 20% of the production. Not bad for 7 or 8 years of mergers or acquisitions. They also control 50% of uranium. And they're moving to control geothermal, hot steam under the ground resources as they find them around the country or buy other people's rights to them. Now, why do they want total control of energy? Because any form of energy that undercuts them threatens their high price structure. The only regulation in Washington that they didn't like, that they got in the last half century, was price regulation of natural gas. And natural gas is cheaper, as well as cleaner, than oil. And that's why they want to get rid of the controls on natural gas in order to raise the price of natural gas to meet the oil price. Since they control both, they want the lowest to go up to the highest level. Indeed, so acquisitive-minded is the oil industry that about the only thing they haven't seized title to in terms of a potential energy source is the sun itself. The effect of all this, of course, is quite clear. A massive inflationary spiral, a massive drive against cancer and other disease prevention, known as pollution prevention, and a massive drive out or buyout of the only price competitors they've ever had, namely the independent producers, refiners, distributors, and gas station owners. And you know, they're getting it. They're getting it almost because of the misery of the people, distracting attention away from the big oil companies and focusing them on Main Street USA and the long gas lines. Look at the evening news. 3-4 months ago, before the gas lines started forming, the evening news would spend some time on the big oil companies. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? They try to interview them. What do you see now? You see now a focus on truckers and strikes, gas lines, people fighting, states fighting each other for bigger allocations. Main Street, the attention is shifted down, and people are so concerned about tomorrow's gas problem that they don't take enough time out to worry about the next 10 years' gas problem and the need for structural change and breakup in the oil industry, to break them up, separate Exxon's pipelines and refineries from Exxon's producers, get them competitive, and the need to get the consumer energy bill through Congress. Now, I'd like to go through, in the absence of an oil executive here, it would be delightful to have the head of Exxon here. First question I'd ask him is, Mr. Exxon, you say you need money to explore for oil. You're short of money. Yes, we need investment capital. Great amount of investment capital. Well, Mr. Exxon, why did you spend $250 million in 1972-73 to change your name from Standard Oil of New Jersey, Esso, and of all names, Humble Oil Company? How much oil did that $250 million find, Mr. Exxon? How much oil? And who paid for that $250 million? Of course, the person who always pays, the consumer. And you remember Gulf, which puts ads in the newspapers, find facts, not fault. Oh, that's right. You don't want to look for a scapegoat. We're not looking for scapegoats. We're looking for the oil industry. They're the ones who are responsible, overwhelmingly. They didn't lift a finger to tell Detroit, why don't you put some more efficient engines in your automobiles? Because they profited from a declining efficiency, sold more gasoline. Who got the consumers into these 13 and 12 mile a gallon automobiles? Where was the great oil industry who's been telling us, they've been warning about this oil crisis for years? Oh yes. Is that why they want production limits in the Southwest? Is that why they haven't invested in refinery capacity, preferring to invest in Europe and Japan in the last 14 years? Because it was more profitable? Is that why, in effect, they suppressed the development of the Alaska oil fields? That's not generally known, is it? Here's the story. In 1953, when the Navy already had its oil reserve in Alaska for defense purposes, like they have in California, Elk Hills, the Navy wanted to explore more for oil. And they had the drilling rig ready above what would have been the first discovery of the North Slope Alaskan oil fields. And they were just ready to drill in 1953 when the White House ordered them off, because the oil companies didn't want Alaska oil discovered then. They had their hands full with Texas, Louisiana, and the Middle East. They didn't want another glut on the marketplace. Where does this fact come from? From the U.S. Naval Office of Petroleum Reserves. And then from testimony before Congress 3 weeks ago. Not controverted a bit by the oil companies. And who do they blame now for the delay of the Alaska pipeline? The environmentalists. Well, a pipeline wouldn't have been built until 1976 if there wasn't a lawsuit by the environmentalists. It's now going to be ready in 78 or 79. And it'll be a little safer. And maybe the Northwest fisheries will be a little more protected because of the standards and the public focus on the potential catastrophe that can come from a serious oil spill in those food-bearing waters. Well, now the oil companies say, those environmentalists, they stopped us from building refineries. Another corporate prevarication on a scale unique to the oil industry's tradition. Who stopped them? They didn't want to build any refineries. They had excess refinery capacity in the late 50s and early 60s, and they weren't interested in increasing that capacity. Indeed, they fought the construction of refineries by smaller oil companies. To wit, Occidental Petroleum Company, an upstart in the industry, wanted to build a massive refinery in Maine a few years ago. And it's true, the environmentalists didn't want it. But they don't have much clout, not against the oil industry. Who beat it? The big oil companies went to Washington. They even brought Governor Love of Colorado in to testify, to his regret now, against the refinery on the grounds that he wanted oil shale in Colorado developed first. And they're the ones who beat it. And that also is before a congressional committee, and also not controverted. That's plain historical record. The big oil companies defeated Occidental's refinery. They also defeated a proposal in Savannah, Georgia, to do a similar refinery. Well, what else are they saying? And now they're saying we have to, in effect, we have to drill offshore. Well, now why do we have to drill offshore? Last year, we consumed 6.5 billion barrels of oil. That's domestic and imported oil. By the way, we shouldn't underestimate the enormous role natural gas plays. That's gotten very little publicity. But natural gas provides somewhat like 70% of the energy that oil provides in this country. But they in effect decided that oil had to be drilled offshore. Okay, 6.5 billion we consumed last year. How much oil is there underground in the 48 states that's already been discovered and not exploited? To understand this, 3 quick points. When an oil well is drilled, they usually take off 25-30% of the oil in the ground, because if to go further costs them more, and they'd rather take the cream off the top of another well. Secondly, the proven reserve figure in this country is based on the price of oil and the effectiveness of the drills and the technology to get at the oil. It has nothing to do with the amount of oil geologically in the ground. And so the oil companies have traditionally been underestimating the oil reserves for some practical reasons. 1, they would pay less property taxes that way. 2, they could tell Washington, scarcity, 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 give us the privileges of the national security umbrella. But now, of course, the secret's out of the bag. Because now, with the price of oil at $5.25 per barrel, old oil, newly discovered oil in the United States is out of sight, $10, $11, $9. At that price, this enormous reservoir of oil in already partially exploited wells underground suddenly is economic. It would have been economic at $4.25, according to the National Petroleum Council a couple years ago. Well, it being suddenly economic, how much oil do we now have underground, not offshore, ready to explore and exploit? 285 billion barrels. It's a figure in the Wall Street Journal. 285 billion barrels. Well, now why do we have to go offshore before we start exploiting 285 billion barrels? That'll take us almost to the year 2000. By then we'll have solar energy and geothermal energy, unless the oil companies block that development. And we won't even have to go into massive offshore development or massive oil shale development where there are trillions of barrels in Colorado and Wyoming. Or perhaps to go to Alaskan oil, there's 100 billion barrels there so far, as well as massive amounts of natural gas. And if we forget all of those billions and trillions of barrels for our 6.5 billion, or maybe a few years from now, 10 billion barrels a year, we might want to look at the Athabascan tar sands in Alberta. They are now economic. And guess how much they contain? The Canadian government says, modestly, 600 billion to 1 trillion barrels of oil. When I said a few weeks ago that the world is literally drowning in oil, Mr. Simon and his oil industry cohorts crawled up the wall in outrage. They said, what an irresponsible statement. Well, look at the figures. Look at the figures and note what some geologists will tell you, that they would doubt if 1/4 of the world's oil has even been discovered. The North Sea is expected to rival the Middle East. They haven't begun exploring in the massive Amazon area. The East Asian coast is very, very promising, not to mention many more finds in the Indonesia area. This doesn't even, of course, take into account the just utterly huge offshore and onshore oil and gas reserves in the Soviet Union, much less Africa and other areas around the country. They're even thinking now of Antarctica, and the Arctic is going to open up even more reservoirs. Well, now, why do they talk scarcity? Why are we given the impression that, we're running out? Trickle, trickle, trickle. Because that's how they can justify shortages, orchestrated shortages, in order to double and double the price of oil. Poor New England, they're paying, some of the people in New England are paying 3 times as much for home heating oil as they paid just last year. This goes on and on and on. Why? You know why? Because people sell themselves short. As expensive as oil is today, people are selling themselves for virtually nothing. They're saying to themselves, what do we count for? What can we do? You can't fight City Hall. How can you fight Exxon? Much less Washington. That is the biggest obstacle to getting this energy situation under the people's control, where it has to be. We own most of the oil and gas in this country, not Exxon. We own it. It's on federal land. It's on shale land, it's on offshore land, it's on onshore land. There's no reason to simply and compliantly wait hours in line at a gas station and not say, look, well, maybe I'm not going to shake the world up or form a civic action group, but at least I'm going to let them know in Washington what I think should be done. Now let's go to Washington. Here you see from this side, the impression is, what's another letter into the wastebasket in a Washington office? Now let's go to Washington. You're sitting in Senator Williams' office. Senator Williams is a secretary tabulating the mail. And she reports to Senator Williams. What's the mail like? You know, moist finger to the wind. And one day, the secretary says, Senator, it seems like the people are learning about the Consumer Energy Act. And Senator Williams says, well, how do you know? He said, we got 3 telegrams today. Perk, 3 telegrams on a bill. You know, people don't know about a bill. It's being spread. Next day, 15 letters and telegrams. What's going on here? Phone up Senator Magnuson. Ask him for more materials. We have to find out what's going on. Next day, 50 come in. Then it becomes a real issue in the office. They're buzzing around, you know, we better put out a statement on this, etc. Next Monday, 400 come in. The place is in an uproar. The people are restless. They're revolting. Now, what I'm telling you is that there is nothing more easier and more effective than to send in those kinds of individually written letters, so they don't like a mimeograph machine, you know, 50 postcards all the same. That doesn't mean that's the most effective thing students or citizens can do. Oh, no, we'll talk about that later. It's far more effective, depending on how much time you got, how much energy you got. But in terms of just the minimum, you know, instead of, you know, saying, well, I'm just going to put all my spare time waiting for gas in a line, you can't believe the impact this would have. Let me give you a good estimate. How much would be needed to get the consumer energy bill through Congress against what is going to be the overwhelming opposition of Nixon and the oil companies? As Jesse Jackson said, the Nixon-Exxon axis. And here's what's necessary. On the one hand, the White House and the big oil industry. On the other hand, it won't be the small oil industry, mind you, because this bill has provisions to enhance the capabilities and the rights of small oil companies and distributors and retailers. What will it take is for about a couple 100,000 people in this country, many of them belonging to various consumer groups, environmental groups, civic action groups, ad hoc anger groups, 200,000 people to say, in the next 6 months, we're going to devote an average of 5 or 6 hours to lobby this bill through Congress. What are we going to do in those 5 or 6 hours? Some will, you know, will have 30 hours, but just average 5 or 6. We're going to get names. We're going to get letters. We're going to call the district offices of the senators and the representatives, which are closer at home, and then they signal to Washington, hey, what's going on here? And we're going to ask the members to come into the districts and have town meetings, and we're going to hammer home our provisions that we have worked out to make sure that this energy gouging never happens again, that the prices are rolled back, and that we have a secure, clean form of energy program and research and development for our future generations as well as present. That's what's needed. And you'll get it through. First, you start with 1/3 of the Congress which will vote your way almost from the beginning. The second third is the, that type of thing, the pendulum congressman. And the last third, they've been bought, rented, and sold for so much that they don't even know what's going on. But all you need that middle third. And the elections are coming up. And the lines are growing longer. You can't believe how they're trying to figure out what is going to be the political consequence of these gasoline lines. Is it just going to be fights among the people and at the gas stations cutting in, people, flaring their tempers? Or is it going to be mobilized with a cutting edge and focused on legislative change that really means something? Is it going to be focused not only on the consumer energy bill, but on the consumer protection bill, which is about to go through in strong form, which will provide a core of lean, hard scientists, economists, accountants, lawyers to battle for the consumer interest before all of these industry-controlled federal regulatory agencies who never hear from the consumer, never hear from the facts on the consumer side, but who now, once this bill is passed, can be taken to court, exposed, challenged, lobbied from the inside. That, by the way, Senator Williams is supporting. I think Senator Case voted for it in 1970. It never passed the House that year. And if you want to get a copy of it, you can send to either Senator Williams or Senator Case for a copy. It's a very innovative thing. It does not regulate. It advocates. That's why the Chamber of Commerce is tearing its hair out, fighting it tooth and nail. A regulatory agency they can take care of. But an advocacy agency, that's another thing. And if it passes, there's no reason why statewide consumer advocacy agencies can't be set up similarly to operate on the state level. In fact, I think there's one to be introduced or introduced in the New Jersey State legislature. That's what can be done. I'll even put it even more concretely. The people in this gymnasium, if they decided to spend 5 to 6 hours a week for the next few months as a civic hobby, some people play bridge, some people bowl, some people watch the Jets or the Rangers, and some people maybe will find time to shape energy policy. Just the people in this gymnasium could swing like that the senatorial delegation and probably half of the House of Representatives. How can one convey the enormous ability that people have for self-defeatism, for giving up before they start? This you can't fight City Hall syndrome that subtly and overtly is drummed into children's heads from kindergarten on up. If anybody has self-esteem in a democracy, it's got to be a citizen's self-esteem. That's what it's got to be. And instead, the citizens who really are active, holding the burdens up for the rest of us, are looked at as if they're sort of kooks, mavericks. I never forget the times I used to go as a child to the town meeting in my New England town. There'd be 200 or 250 people there, and there'd be a half a dozen really active citizens standing up, asking the selectmen and the mayor questions and not taking no for an answer, and they seemed to be very well informed. And the rest of the people would sort of say, well, it's really nice we have these active citizens, but they'd be a little uneasy, as if there's just sort of, breaking the conformity here a bit. Can you imagine talking back to the mayor third time around? How impolite. The next day, one of these citizens would be walking down the street, and people would be, this is when they were using sidewalks, and people would be walking along and say, hey, look, there goes Mr. Franz. Like you have the town drunk, the town fool, and the town citizen. No, we've got to reverse this so that the mavericks, are the ones who don't uphold their citizen responsibilities. Well, now, I don't have copies of these bills with me for you to read. And I'm sure once you read these bills, you'll have your own ideas, too. They're just sort of some of the thought of really consumer-minded senators. They don't exhaust it. For example, they want to give small business a kind of day-in-court act so that the franchises aren't pulled away from them arbitrarily. But if you are interested, all it takes is a letter to the senator asking for copies of the Consumer Energy Act and the Consumer Protection Act and asking him what stand are they taking on these bills. And if they don't support them, you'd like a long letter of explanation. If these activities can get underway, you'll be able to maximize the impact of the best year in modern history to tame the oil industry. A year sandwiched in between Watergate on the one hand and the November election on the other. A year sandwiched in between a fake energy crunch, which most people believe to be fake, regardless of what Simon says and regardless of what Exxon says. An interesting change. It used to be the days, when a few radio programs and a few full-page ads and the public was brainwashed. Not anymore. People can take advantage of this situation and get some good out of it for all the pain and the gouging. Get some good out of it. We've got two ways we can go in this energy situation. We can go the way the oil industry wants us to go. Double the price. Pollution standards lowered. Easy leases on offshore drilling. Driving out small business competitors. Dislocating the economy. Unemploying people. Spiraling the inflation overall. And building more of these catastrophically risked nuclear power plants. Or we can go the other way. We can go by having a short-term and a long-term strategy. Short-term, we rely on oil and gas. And where we have to rely on coal, under stricter controls for pollution. Short-term, we begin phasing in solar energy for heating and cooling of buildings and homes, and geothermal energy over the next 20, 30 years, until they become more and more significant. 2%, 4%, 7%. And then we've got it licked. Because once we rely on solar energy, perhaps with some geothermal reservoirs, that's forever. I mean, if the sun ever runs out, we've got other problems. And while the federal government has spent $30 billion into nuclear fission of the taxpayers' money since 1946, they've spent $20 million for solar energy, 12 of which was last year, which means they really haven't started. And yet, there are some homes who already, handmade, have solar energy units to heat the homes. A fellow in Washington has had one for 9 years. His heating bill last winter was $4.70. RCA announces, hardly a radical corporation, RCA announces an extension of its New York City headquarters to be built and heated and cooled via solar energy. Farmers have used solar energy for many, many years. That's how they grow their crops. Only a fraction of 1% of the solar energy that comes to Earth could power the needs of a world in the year 2000. Now, the fact that we can lick the problem doesn't mean that the oil or energy industries are going to allow us to. They don't want cheap, abundant sources of energy floating around. They've got fossil fuels or they've got uranium. So that's going to be one battle, and that's why the Consumer Energy Act is so important, because it puts a TVA-type producer right there. And it puts a research and development program right there. And that's why it's important for all of us to be able to say to ourselves, this month we spent X amount of time as citizen shapers of our energy policy. One thing we must never forget, this is why we started our 2-year study of the U.S. Congress. No matter how powerful industry is, no matter how insensitive and bureaucratized the executive branch of government is in Washington, there's one Khyber pass they all have to go through. It's called the Congress. And although the Congress tends to be pushed around and abdicate its power to the White House, that is so because the people don't control the Congress. And someone should say, well, can the people control the Congress? Well, is there any other institution that's more easily controlled than the Congress? They got job insecurity every 2 and 6 years. They are very sensitive to public opinion. They fear the people. It's a very healthy sign. They still fear the people. It's more than you can say for the executive branch. And as a result, there is no question that we can control the Congress. One of the reasons why our founding fathers, when they divided the federal government to judiciary, legislative, and executive branches, where did they put the most important powers of government? Not in the presidency. The power to declare war, to appropriate funds, to tax, are constitutionally in the Congress. And they can get them back, in fact, if we get Congress back. The power to declare war, to appropriate funds, to tax, are constitutionally in the Congress. And they can get them back, in fact, if we get Congress back to us. And that's where the policy can be shaped. And in a way, that's where the strategy should focus on. Sure, it'll take a lot of people to take on the Department of Interior. They got nothing to lose except their job to get into the oil industry. But it doesn't take that much to go after Congress. And where do you think the Department of Interior gets its lifeblood, its money, its authority, like any other department of government? From Congress. This is why we focused on Congress. This is why we've put out profiles, 20 to 40-page profiles, on every member of Congress standing for election in 1972, voting records, lobbying tactics, who they listen to, how they treat their constituents' problems back home, how they work their committees, how assiduous are they in their duties, what they believe, what don't they believe, etc. Most of these profiles we've gotten into libraries around the country, or Pacific groups have asked for them. We're also putting out 13 volumes on each committee of Congress and various dimensions of Congress, such as relations with the executive branch. The reason we've put so much effort into this project is precisely because we think that is the most important lever of national citizenship. That's where it can start, and that's where it can stop in the U.S. Congress. I'd also like to suggest another aspect here. That if we ask ourselves, what does it mean to live in a democracy? It means to have certain rights. It means to have certain rights respected. It means to have equal protection under the law. It means to have certain opportunities. Does it mean to have certain obligations? I think so. I don't think rights are worth very much. And they're certainly not protected very well if the people who hold those rights don't exert correlative obligations. If people have the right to vote and only half of the people vote, and the other half don't really take a consistent interest in the issues that they want the politicians to take stands on, then we get Tweedledum and Tweedledee on the ballot form in November. So the question to ask is, well, what is citizenship obligation? Here's what it is. It's citizens working on problems of their choice, affecting the community, local, state, national, international, and trying to better these situations, trying to develop better society. Nobody has to be forced to work on a problem that doesn't interest him or her, because there are so many food co-ops to sidestep the Safeways and the AMPs. It could be any number of things. Like daycare centers are being set up by citizens getting together and sparking this process. And perhaps we should ask 4 questions, all of us. 1, how many hours a week do we put on our job? 2, how many hours a week do we put on our family responsibilities? 3, how many hours a week do we put on our leisure? 4, how many hours a week do we put on our civic obligations? Maybe the fourth answer will help answer the third answer. And maybe the fourth and third answers will help make more meaningful the first and the second answers. That's where it's at. We think there's been more than enough disclosure about our problems in the country. There's been more than enough disclosure about the fact that we have far more solutions than we're using, because vested interests aren't interested in many of these solutions. They lead to reduced sales and reduced profits and new habits of concern by business for the public. We need now manuals, how to do it. How do you reform property tax? How do you test and clean up drinking water? How do you make sure that questions of importance are decided by the people? If people are going to live near nuclear power plants, which if one has a big accident could wipe out a significant part of New Jersey with hundreds of thousands of fatalities and casualties, then I think the people should learn about it, get the facts, and vote. They're the potential victims at risk. They're the ones who should ask why the insurance companies don't insure these nuclear plants beyond 1% of their credible maximum accident, if they're so safe. The people should ask these questions. The people should say, we're concerned about radioactivity, which produces cancer, leukemia, genetic deaths, stillbirths. We wonder whether we really need nuclear power, given the oil and gas that we've got. Why do we need something which, if a truck spills and breaks the cask with hot radioactive materials, we can have a minor catastrophe? Or if a plant has a meltdown and releases radioactive gases, showering more radioactivity over a 100-mile radius by about 1,000-fold than the radioactivity from the Hiroshima weapon. What do we need these risks for? Do we really believe that this technology is never going to have an accident the way our government says so? Has the fact that there have been 800 or more serious incidents, as the government calls them, in existing power plants, nuclear power plants, is that assurance that we're not going to have a big accident someday when we have 1,000 of these plants all over the country with trucks and rail cars carrying these deadly wastes that are mortally lethal for tens of thousands of years? We've got a right to vote on this, to demand that we, the people who are exposed, make the decisions. Not bureaucrats, utility commissions, not public service or Consolidated Edison. The manuals that I'm talking about are the kind you see now. For example, how to make a supermarket price comparison, how to investigate and fight nuclear power. We've put out some of these manuals. Other groups around the country put out them as well. One of ours is called the Public Citizens Action Manual, which is out in paperback. It's composed of 30 community-type problems that people can tackle and do something about. Employment discrimination, how to investigate your favorite government agency, how to set up your citizen lobby, how to investigate occupational diseases and job hazards, how to do a supermarket price comparison survey, how to take over your savings and loan association, since you're supposed to be the owners of it, as depositors, and so forth. By the way, if you're interested in any of these citations, there'll be a description here afterwards if you want to come up and obtain them. The important thing is that you'll be able to develop these strategies and tactics, as some of you who have been engaged in causes know full well, once you simply apply your time to the problem at hand. And what was once the unknown, what was once the difficult, becomes the knowable or known and the feasible or implementable measure. I think we need to spend much more time in our country talking up citizen action, and less time talking up who's going to run for office in 76 or 74. Because it doesn't make a whale of a difference who runs. If the people are not organized to stop the crooks in government and to support the good people in government. Otherwise, it's going to be the same old business with the trade associations, the special interest groups, the corporate law firms, shaping and regulating the government to their own narrow benefit. But then citizen action isn't glamorous, you know. It doesn't have the speculative, gossipy quality that columnists like to write about in newspapers. For instance, 500,000 students in this country are now assessing themselves $4 to $6 a year in 18 states to support their own full-time lawyers, scientists, economists, organizers in the form of public interest research groups. There's one here in New Jersey. New Jersey PIRG, it's called, out of Trenton. Small, but increasingly effective, supported by Rutgers students. Now, Fairleigh Dickinson students considering supporting them. There are groups in Oregon, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Michigan, doing great things. In Minnesota, they blocked illegal timbering on federal land. In Oregon, they prepared a mass transit plan for the city of Portland. It was better in some respects than the one worked on for several $100,000 by consultants. In Oregon, they also passed through a bill banning credit discrimination against women by banks, savings and loan associations. In Vermont, they got a bill through a child dental care program, a marvelous piece of legislation based on a study and survey of dental care among children in rural Vermont. In Massachusetts, they held up a utility rate increase, earning the gratitude of the local community, beginning to overcome this town-gowned foolishness, which fortunately community colleges do not suffer from anywhere near as four-year colleges and universities do. And in New York, they're doing something really interesting. They're studying the New York State Legislature. They're producing profiles, voting records, and other performance information on each legislature so the citizens have some information on which to base their deliberations and how they respond to these legislators. In Michigan, they just put out a blockbuster report on the hazards of transporting radioactive materials by rail and truck. Got national publicity and certainly deserved it, working with some faculty members at the University of Michigan, particularly in the physics department, so that these PIRGs are not only full-time citizen career roles supported by students, but they are also projects that open up opportunities for students to research and help on to such a demanding degree that many teachers in these states are giving course credit for students who work on PIRG projects. In Oregon, they're up to 60 courses providing course credit. And the faculty begins getting involved. And then we have perhaps a new vitalism, a new vitality to education that gets students working on problems of real interest to themselves and motivates their normative impulse as well as their analytic skills and links knowledge to action and makes students perhaps appreciate that the real education is self-education long after graduation. If any of the students here are interested in learning more about the New Jersey PIRG, there's a law student member of the New Jersey PIRG who will be here afterwards, and you can come up and talk to him. Is he here? Yes, he's right here. If you just stand up for a moment. Seton Hall Law School, a member of the New Jersey PIRG. By the way, these PIRGs are controlled and funded by the students themselves and elected student board of directors from the various areas where the students support these groups. Well, now, do you hear much about these on TV? You know, national news? They don't break any windows, you see. They don't burn down any administration buildings. They're just winning lawsuits, passing laws, developing support for other community groups, and putting out a ream of beautifully articulated and documented studies of problems at the local and state level. Who do you think is representing the consumer point of view on energy in this state? Christopher Berg in New Jersey PIRG. He's going on radio and television vis-a-vis these oil companies so they don't monopolize their side of the story without getting it cross-examined. I would urge you, because a community college in many ways is a college that started on the philosophy of community involvement. No Harvard, no Yale, with their magnificent scholarly edifices rising above the rot of Boston and New Haven, as if they have no accountability and no responsibility to apply all this knowledge to improve their immediate environment. Oh no. The community college is premised on being an information center for students at a young age, adults at all ages, daytime classes, nighttime classes. And perhaps it will increasingly involve itself into a problem-solving center, linking knowledge to action as the true spirit of education would require. That's the potential of community colleges and the potential of this public interest research group movement around the country. And I would urge some of you who are interested, whether you're in night courses or day courses, no matter what your age is, to find out more about what they've done and to see if you too want to participate and extend their work into this area here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I know there are people who have questions or comments, and I'll repeat the question or comment in case there is no public address system here, so that those of you in the back can hear. Yes? The question is, do I think that the Nixon administration and the Johnson administration have been the instrument, willing or unwilling, of some super clandestine world financial organization? No, they're not clandestine at all. They're called First National, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Morgan Guarantee. They do. The banks are coming in for more scrutiny, as you've been probably reading about, with some of the reports from the Senate documenting their pyramiding ownership of airlines and oil companies and other major industries through their massive pension fund portfolios, trust fund portfolios, as well as regular equity ownership. And I really think that the thing the banks have gotten going for them all these years to shield them from public scrutiny is the fact that people think that banks are so complex they couldn't possibly begin to understand them. Well, for those of you who think so, I would urge you to write Congressman Wright Patman, P-A-T-M-A-N, House of Representatives in Washington, that great populist who's now almost 80 years old, has been fighting the big banks for years, to send you a primer on money, as he calls it, where he tried to simplify the function of banks and the banking system without sacrificing too much detail for people to understand. We've put out a study on Citibank, called it Citibank. The Citibank executives found it very disagreeable. There's a book out called The Bank Book by an anonymous vice president of a bank who decided he'd had enough and he blew the whistle. And there's also a book called, I've forgotten the name of it now. The author is Charles Elias. And it just came out last year also on banks. But it is remarkable. One time I said to several bankers I was talking to, I said, you know what, do you think banking should be part of the consumer movement? They didn't know. They said, could you say that again in English? You see, when you people think of the consumer movement, what do you think of? Auto safety, food prices, maybe auto insurance, changing them, improving them. We don't connect up with banks, but I suppose that the process is increasing, so people are getting more You know what also is leading to interest in banks is that the little banks are being gobbled up. Now you've got more branch banking around the country, and the one bank holding company buying into insurance and travel agencies and leasing companies and data processing companies. There used to be a hard line in federal law. You want to be bankers? You stay bankers. Unlike Europe, where the banks owned industry and were into everything. Well, now that one bank holding company is going to open it up even more, and so the banks are going to be drawn into it whether they like it or not. But that doesn't mean they're going to be any weaker at the beginning. Yes? Question is, how extensive is the frequency of high administration officials around Mr. Nixon connected with the oil industry? Very extensive. I gave you some illustrations. I mean, the people, not so much Rogers Martin, though. He's one of the few Secretary of Interiors that hasn't had close connections. He comes from Maryland. He doesn't come from the oil-bearing states. Pardon? Yes, they're brothers, I think, yes. I mean, they may have investment connections, but it's not as, as blatant as coming right out of an oil company into government. But I could make you a list of 30 officials in the federal government at the present time in high policy-making levels who are connected or have been connected with the oil companies, have every intention to go back. Peter Flanagan in the White House, oil tankers. Well, the people who can give you the list who've compiled the list is the International Association of Machinists, the labor union. They've put it in some of their newsletters. There? Yes. The question is, where do Case and Williams stand on the two consumer bills that I mentioned? I don't know how they're going to vote this year, but I think both of them are okay on the consumer bill. I don't know whether Ms. Senator Williams has yet signed on the consumer energy bill. I don't think Senator Case has yet. In fact, I'm quite sure he is. Yes, the Senate is a little ahead, but Congressman Moss, California, Congressman Dingell of Michigan have already introduced a similar bill. And so you'd want to get, who's your congressman from this district? Okay. The Harris poll says only half of the people in this country can name their congressman. But there are some key congressmen that from New Jersey who would have to be brought around on this. Weidler, for example. Yes. How many of the 800 accidents are actually nuclear accidents? They are related to the unique characteristics of a nuclear reactor. Yes. They could have, but only from another design point of view. I mean, a turbine blade, for example. Yeah, but it is if the turbine blade strikes or damages the emergency core cooling system, let's say. It gets a little fuzzy in that area. But there have been problems which haven't resulted in accidents yet, which have required a derating of the power. Fuel densification problems, hydraulic shock absorbers deficient, emergency core cooling systems deficient, and so forth. These have not yet sequenced into an accident, but they increase the probability of it. And they've been recognized by the AEC. Back there? Anyone back there? Yes. 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 The question dealt with wind power. By the way, it was only a few years ago, and people say, wind power? Ha, ha, ha. And now they're taking it quite seriously. The Wall Street Journal had a very serious article on it recently. Professor Hieronymus, University of Massachusetts, has written extensively on it. And you see, science has fads, it has fashions, contrary to popular impression. And the woman was saying that there is a New Jersey state legislator, Rosemary who? Yes, she has put a resolution in to promote the development of wind power in New Jersey, and she encourages people to find out about this resolution and support it. Someone on this side? Yes, sir?
How much do you think this oil they found in the last week or so they're going to distribute is just to use public outrage?
How much is the oil, is the fact that the oil they found recently, they're going to distribute more gasoline simply to confuse public outrage? It's just thrashing around. It's thrashing around. You know, I mean, the one thing Simon and Mr. Nixon don't want to do is get down to fundamentals. The structure of the oil industry. And the Federal Trade Commission, contrary to the White House, is getting down to fundamentals. So is the Senate, the Joint Economic Committee. So is the Senate Subcommittee on Multinational Corporations, but not the policymakers in the executive branch. Back there? What is the status and potential of the electric automobile? For short-range vehicle use, it's obviously at hand. By short range, under 40 miles per hour for in-city driving. There are already thousands of such vehicles in Britain. I think there's something like 10,000 electric trucks in Britain. The only problem with electric trucks, assuming we're willing to have two kinds of vehicles, long-distance, high-speed vehicles and, 20 miles radius type vehicles, is where are you going to get the electricity for the batteries? And if you get it from nuclear power, it's not worth it. If you get it from fossil fuels or more safe forms of energy, fossil fuels under pollution controls, then it's interesting. But not if it's going to lead to a massive development of nuclear fission plants. Yes? That's a perceptive question. Is the energy crisis as we know it today enough to keep Nixon and Watergate in office for the next 3 years? It is interesting, is it not, that years ago, if we were in a mess like this, the whammy would be on the president's back. I mean, don't you remember just 10, 15 years ago, you'd get a little unemployment, and everybody would say, okay, Mr. President, what are you going to do? Well, Watergate, in a way, has taken so much that when the president really messes up the country and refuses to put the policies in that will begin straightening out the process, he doesn't get any responsibility heaped on him. Well, certainly crises divert attention to Watergate. In fact, Energy often took it off page 1. But I don't think he's going to be able to ride out the whole Watergate-related criminality, which goes way beyond the burglary and the Watergate. That's tiddlywinks. It goes into putting an illegal espionage office in operation in the White House to perform criminal acts in the name of the national security. It goes to bribery, forgery, shakedowns, extortion, cover-ups, obstruction of justice, usurpation of the Constitution, illegal impoundment, or say so 35 courts, and on and on and on. And I think the process is on two levels, public opinion and the congressional and prosecutorial level. To what extent public opinion is going to make the difference remains to be seen. But I think already he is enmeshed in the legal process to a point where he's not going to be able to divert it very easily. It really is a shame, is it not, for a country to have to absorb this kind of disgrace based on evidence already admitted and proved. You remember President Eisenhower's problems with Sherman Adams? The poor fellow took a vicuna coat, and Eisenhower said, out. Now, we're not dealing with just one person in the White House who might have misled the president. Neither are we dealing with 3 people, nor are we dealing with 6 people. It's hard to find any high-level aide in the White House who wasn't involved in one or more of these criminal violations. And you know, you don't get 18 special aides appointed by the president working in the White House, doing what was done if the president didn't condone or participate or tolerate. But there needs to be no speculation, even on that score, because he has already admitted many things: San Clemente, the archives, the plumber's office, which he set up, and many other things that are linked directly to him. Well, I think if we're going to ever clean up government, the chance to clean it up is when it's sunk to its lowest, at the highest level. And just imagine the cynicism all over the country that will increase if the big boys get away with it. This planned criminal pattern of behavior by power-drunk, unelected aides around a president who thought that his landslide election would provide him with a mandate to ride it out. We have got to evaluate presidents between elections, particularly elections that were procured without full knowledge of the facts by the electorate. Let's see. Question is, given the rise of greater industrial concentration, are we going to enter into a trust-busting era such as occurred at the turn of the century to break up these monopolies? And if so, who's going to be the instrument? I think we'll have more antitrust action, anti-monopoly action. Such a bad word. You know, at the turn of the century, everybody knew what the trusts were. They were the monopolies, but now it's an old-fashioned word. So we're really talking about anti-monopolies. The big case brought against the oil monopoly is the first indication. In a few months, the Federal Trade Commission will unload on the food monopolies. And I think if we had, and mind you, this is in spite of a president and a White House that's singularly antagonistic to anti-monopoly actions. This is the ITT White House. Now, if you get a new White House that's just friendly, never mind eager, to antitrust or anti-monopoly enforcement, you're going to get a massive law enforcement process going here. And I think part of it will be due to people waking up to the economic effects, the pocketbook and health and safety effects of monopolies, like oil, as well as to the rise of consumer and environmental movements, as well as to a growing interest in Congress in this type of amplified legislation. Yes? I didn't hear the last 8 words, which can no longer what? Yes. question dealt with the desire by GM and Chrysler operating through their Argentinian auto manufacturing plants to sell large U.S. automobiles to Cuba. Cuba apparently wants big U.S. cars, which are a little bit in surplus these days. The question was, what do I think about this change in our policy toward Cuba because of the rise of the multinational corporation, in this case GM and Chrysler operating in Argentina? I've not really studied that in any details. I really can't comment on it. I don't particularly, I wouldn't like to inflict big American cars on any country. But if it opens up trade, which leads to a resumption of better relations, there certainly is a benefit to accrue from that. Yes? Why have the big car companies allowed the oil companies to get away with this? Well, for a simple reason. Big industries never fight each other in public. And for the auto companies to try to tell the oil companies to do a little bit, okay, but to try to tell them, look, stop, don't double the price of oil, that's when they part ways. That's when the interests of the oil company is such where it says to the auto company, you're telling us what to do? You should have put out smaller cars a long time ago. Don't bother us. Smaller cars that run on 13 miles a gallon, however. So the interest of the oil industry was not going to be stopped by the auto industry, even though something like 20%, 25% of petroleum products goes through the automobile engine. Question is, do I mean to say that it doesn't make any difference who is elected in '76 as to the price of food or the price of oil? Let me put it this way. I certainly think that things could be somewhat worse. But I would like to say that no matter what a Kennedy or who else did you say? Or a McGovern, no matter what they said they would do, most of that could not be done unless they had a solid citizen constituency around them to battle the lobbyists and battle all the pressures that go in on them in Washington. I've seen too many platforms, including John Kennedy's platform, mostly go down the drain because they just couldn't muster or wouldn't muster the forces to fight the pressures that came down on them. You know, John Kennedy wanted to do something about the oil industry. He really did. That's a very important story to be told as to how that move was stopped in no uncertain terms. Now, if he could go out to the people, if the people knew about the oil industry, what was going on, what the gouging was, he'd do it. He'd be able to do it more. Any president would. But I'm saying that the absence of strong citizen, tax reform, environmental, small business groups tends to level the rhetoric, the differing rhetoric of presidential candidates once they get into office and try to put it into effect. Yes, sir? The question is, he finds it difficult to believe that the oil companies are so stupid as to create such a shortage since, for example, in his case, he is driving less than he used to, therefore buying less than he used to. Yes, there is a slight reduction in demand, although not as dramatic as your personal experience would indicate. But the price is going to be double. The price is going to be double, and they think that within a few months the demand will come back up again as people get over, some people get over the shock of paying 60 or 70 cents a gallon. And you know they're right, because the alternatives are not there. You can't get into a sleek mass transit vehicle. How do you get to school here, you know? And you see, in other words, they have recognized all along, as the economists say, that there is not much elasticity of demand to increased oil price. You see, that when the price goes up, it isn't like the demand goes down commensurately. It goes down just a little bit when the price goes up a big bit. And then after a while, it'll just move right back up again because you don't have the alternatives. If you don't have a car, you don't move in many areas of the country. Presumably. You know, I mean, they may 2-3 miles more. Maybe so, but it still doesn't average out to this from 34 cents, 35, 36 cents a gallon to 75 cents a gallon. That's double. Yes? Oh yes, I'd be very happy. You mean to have... The question is, what is the possibility of having a low-level conference with the president on consumer issues? Pardon? As a representative? First of all, you'll wait for months if you ever get an appointment. And then when you get an appointment, it's 20 minutes and not listening. Not listening. Yes? Yes, yes. The question is, he read a book a few years ago by Senator Metcalf called Overcharge about the prices of the public utilities to consumers, electric companies, and he wants to know whether anything's been done in the meantime. Not really, no. The only proposal put forth is to have a consumer advocate for these before the Utility Commission, but that never passed the Congress. So there's not much that's been done. You know what they're doing now. You know, a few years ago they were saying demand is going up so fast we've got to have higher rates to expand our capacity. And then a few months ago, last year, they told you to conserve. 1, 2, 3, 4, here's how you can conserve electricity and gas. And now several utilities around the country are asking for rate increases on the grounds that people have conserved and therefore their revenues are down. Like New England Power Company, Washington Gas Company, maybe here in New Jersey. Someone I haven't called on? Yes? That's a very good question. He says, as big as the auto companies are, he never hears them talking about this energy shortage, or I take it for criticizing the oil industry. It's the club. They've been working together for expanding the interstate highway system. You know, oil, tires, and autos mix very well. And they've been working together in a number of areas, and they've had interlocking directorates and so forth. And, you know, they're privately angry, but they will ride it out. It'll be a slight dip in their fabulous profits of last year, and pretty soon people will be buying $3,200 Vegas. So they'll produce more small cars, jack up the price fast, as is already occurring, faster than the big cars are going up, and then they'll be up to $3,200, $3,300, $3,400, and their profit margins will come back to their former self. That's their plan. What? No, I don't think so. I mean, there'll be a shift to smaller cars, but I mean, it won't go like Europe. It won't go as far as Europe. Yes. Oh yes, I think they're definitely going to be phased down. They're even building compact Cadillacs now. Yes. You got a book on that? The effect of multinational corporations on the food industry? You mean the impact of the multinational food industries on, say, foreign countries? Oh, I see what you mean. Well, let's take the multinational grain companies. Yes, by the export of grain, the Russian grain deal and other similar deals, it led to a very tight supply in this country and a massive food inflationary spiral, or speculative spiral, depending on your viewpoint. You see, as long as the Department of Agriculture keeps the production down, and it did until quite recently, when there's a tightening of an increase of demand abroad for these huge deals, the price just goes sky high. It's just like a tense rubber band. That's why the bakers are now talking about $1 a loaf. Part of it's just getting the public ready psychologically. But part of it is due to, once again, Mr. Butts, Department of Agriculture, underestimated the demand, and nothing will happen to his particular job, but the consumers will pay much more as a result. This is a tough question. You know, first of all, it's a question of feeding poor people abroad, even though some of them may be in China. It's a question of how much we want to put back in production here. It's a question of how much the middleman is going to be allowed to take. Well, of all these questions, how many of these questions do consumers have a role in deciding? They got a role in paying, not a role in deciding. I don't think, that's why a consumer agency is so important in Washington. Secretary of Agriculture Butts doesn't care about consumers, about bakers. I mean, he cares about farmers. And if they can make $300,000 a year, that's all the better for him. That's what his job is. Now, who says to Mr. Butts, slow down, Ernie, slow down, here comes the consumer? Who says to him that? And why? There's nobody representing him. The farmers are represented by Agriculture Department. Business is represented by most of the departments. Organized labor has some advocacy from the Labor Department. Who represents the consumer? That's why that consumer bill is so important. And it's going to go through this year. 5 years we've been working on it. This year it'll probably go through. He may veto it, and then there'll have to be an override of the veto. But finally, there'll be someone beginning to hammer away for the consumer. It isn't just the consumer, mind you. It isn't just the consumer paying less or having safer and more healthful products. It's that when the consumer gets tough, then the retailer gets tough to the wholesaler, and the wholesaler gets tough to the manufacturer, and there's more efficiency and innovation all the way up the line. Because they won't be able to say, well, we don't like to pay these higher prices, but put it on the consumer's back. Transfer it to the consumer, and inefficiency and monopolies are rewarded. That's the importance, really, of the consumer's well-being. I don't know. How many senators and representatives have invested in oil stocks on Mr. Simon's recommendations? In the past, you say? You mean when he was in the investment? In the New York investment banking firm? I don't know. He was a bond trader, but the firm itself dealt with the oil industry as well. But he was a municipal bond specialist, like John Mitchell was. There is substantial investments in the oil industry by senators and representatives. For instance, Senator Long has about $2.25 million in the oil industry. He doesn't make any bones about it. He says, that's my state, Louisiana. It's the oil and gas industry. Yes? I'm sorry, is there a maximum price? Yes, they want to level off at $7.50 a barrel. They're now at $5.25 for old oil. Mr. Simon has told people that he thinks $7.50 is the equilibrium price. Now, it was $3.25, 2.25 years ago. Okay, so it's over double. That's the whole strategy of Simon, Nixon, and the oil industry. They think that's when demand will go down a little and supply will be encouraged. A lot of other things will happen too, but they don't like to talk about that, like oil company profits. That's what they're talking about. Now that translates out to 70, 80 cents a gallon. The only way it's going to come down is for the cartel to be broken into, and for independent producers and others to start pushing oil to market. And that's going to be very hard when the cartel controls most of the refineries and pipelines and most of the retail distribution. So the only hope is that Federal Oil and Gas Company and the FTC's action to break up the oil companies. Those are the two main thrusts. Yes, sir. I didn't hear, sir. That's a question. Why did ARCO drop 2 cents and the rest of the industry increased 5 cents around the same time? ARCO was asked that question. They simply said that we're responding to market conditions. I don't know why. Could be they had a oversupply. Could be they wanted to get a public relations advantage temporarily. It's hard to find out without them coming clean or coming to a committee and testifying on it. I know, for example, Standard Oil of Indiana dropped a little bit, and Senator Percy sort of said, well, he sort of took credit for that. He talked to the head of Standard Oil of Indiana. I mean, sometimes it's just a little PR type thing. Take the heat off, and to show that the industry isn't monolithic. Yeah, let's see. Someone I haven't called on? Yes? So some of the wheat we sold to Russia are going to be sold back to the U.S. at a higher price. That was the flurry of speculation a few weeks ago, but I don't think it's going to be done. It's political, if they do it. The Russians had a good wheat crop this year. They want to sell wheat to the United States. It's amazing. Only Nixon could get away with this. Selling wheat to the Russians, selling the consumer down the drain, and then talk about buying the wheat back from Russia at a higher price. I mean, this is the Cold War warrior, Mr. Nixon. Governor Love was removed for 2 reasons. One, he was for immediate rationing, and Mr. Nixon wasn't. And second, he lost out in a struggle with Simon. Simon's a real inside fighter. And Governor Love, true to his name, was not up to the task. question is, how do you reconcile the dual motivations of most people? Farmers are farmers and they're consumers, and workers are workers and they're consumers. And workers want higher wages, farmers want higher prices. On the other hand, they want lower prices in the marketplace. How can these be reconciled? By the adversary process, that's one. Second, people define their own priorities differently. For instance, a lot of workers have no difficulty trying to get a more decent wage on the one hand from their steel mill and trying to get a better auto insurance policy premium from their auto insurance policy. They see the steel mill as somewhat different than the auto insurance policy, and to some extent they are. Everything sure is interrelated, but there's the intensity of interrelation that's key. Workers, for example, working in a bank will want lower supermarket prices. And they may not want, let's say, lower interest rates or lower bank services, but others will. And it's the conflict, the adversary process that tries to get the truth out where there is gouging, where there is monopolistic pricing, where there is water and ham and chicken, where there is these kinds of deceptions, and root them out. So that's the way the tussle goes. And I think there are going to be conflicts sometimes. For example, the auto workers sometimes don't want auto prices to go down because they think their wages will go down. However, there are a lot of workers that do want auto prices to go down, and speaking as consumers, they have got a right to advocate their point of view. And it may well be that in the clash of points of view, it comes out that the auto companies really are overpricing their automobiles, and that they should go down or not increase as rapidly. Yes? Sure. Yes. Sure. I mean, what has happened is, as the pressure built up on the auto companies to put pollution control systems on, a variety of choices appeared. One was, and by the way, they began to be put on notice in the early 50s in California to get cleaning up their cars. One choice was to displace the internal combustion engine with a new type of engine. Efficient, non-polluting. Take 8-9 years to do it. Plenty of lead time. Get it ready by 1960. That's 8 years. Another is what they did. They put tack-on devices. Keep the engine the same, put the tack-on devices. An intermediate thing perhaps would be to work on their fuel or develop a stratified charge engine the way Honda does. Right? Honda has proved it. They can meet the federal standards in 75, 76 with a stratified charge engine, which they put into a model Chevy just to rub it in GM's a bit. And it worked. Little Honda, hip pocket of GM, building cars for 6-7 years. They did it. GM says it can't be done. But my answer to your immediate question is, you said you reduced your mileage efficiency from 20 miles to about 11 or 10. It most definitely is not entirely attributable to the auto pollution control system. That one of the biggest factors in reducing mileage efficiency on cars is weight. And to give you a distinction, the 1958 Impala weighs 1,500 pounds less than the 1973 Impala with full options and air conditioning equipment. Weight is a tremendous factor. The cars get bigger, wider, heavier, more options. Is a far more important factor than the admittedly inefficient way they went about putting a pollution control system on your car. The EPA has just done a test. You remember when the Chevrolet dealers put an ad in the paper, incredibly enough, 3 months ago, saying, take the emission controls off your car and get many more miles on a gallon?
GM denied any involvement in that. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agencies, put out a rebuttal to that ad, and they also showed that unless an expert, a real expert, takes that emission control thing off your car, that the fuel efficiency will be 3% worse. Number two, General Motors has said that their 1975-76 cars will be more efficient by at least 7% with the controls they have. So if we're to believe GM, and so one of the few times they've ever gone the other way, you know, given us an optimistic projection, these controls, the catalytic system, is supposed to increase efficiency over the 73, 74 cars. Sure. The question is it proper to say that the primary cause of inflation is a rapid expansion of the money supply and that wage, price controls, etc., are secondary? I know that's Milton Friedman's approach. I don't subscribe to it for two reasons. One is I don't subscribe that degree of importance to the money supply as a sui generis force. The money supply increases. Inflation may increase under certain conditions. But there are reasons why the money supply is pushed to increase. And those reasons remain in the banking, industrial, and government spending areas. It's, in other words, Friedman thinks that's sort of a sui generis cause. Starts from first base or from home plate. I think basically it's a symptom of other industrial and financial developments that put the pressure. Well, thank you very much. Huh? Thank you very much. Okay.
All right. You don't have to say anything then.